So for project design, there's a few sort of key questions that can help in your project design to figure out how you're going to communicate to the expert committee what your project is, what problem it's going to solve, and how your approach is going to lead to change. You should be thinking about the what, how, why, and who. So, for example, what is the problem? What are the key drivers? Who is affected and to what extent? Are women, people with disabilities, and other marginalised people affected in different ways in this context? What will your project do to improve the situation, and how will your project address the key problem drivers? Again, coming back to the evidence point, why is your approach the best approach? Have others tried to improve the situation? What worked and what hasn't worked in the past? And key to any project is its stakeholders and partners. And people are very central to a strong project design. So it's important to identify the key stakeholders, who are the most relevant people for your situation and project, who's going to have or should have the most influence. Plan how you're going to engage with those people and how often and on what subjects. So the type of and level of engagement might depend on the key stakeholder group. And your approach to working with key stakeholders might differ from your approach to working with partners who have a role in the project decision-making processes. So thinking about this sphere of control, influence, and concern, your core team and implementing partners will have most control over the design decisions and approach in your project. And the key stakeholders should have some influence on that too, so they can feed into what they think is needed, and that can be the communities that you're supporting. There are also people that might be interested in your project, but are not necessarily going to have influence. So think about how you might be sharing information that's useful for them. And following on from people, some of the key points to consider are how you're going to showcase the gender equality, disability, and social inclusion considerations of your projects. So as Yoli mentioned, in round two, partnership grants projects must have at minimum a GEDC empowering approach. So think about how you're going to showcase that in your proposal. GEDC empowering is defined here in Ocean as reducing gender and social inequalities and empowering community members by increasing equitable access to assets, resources, and capabilities for women, people with disabilities, and other marginalised groups. And there's more breakdown of that definition in our GEDC ambition statement and GEDC guidance, which you can find on our website. But just some general tips. GEDC should be mainstreamed across all of your project design aspects, including MEL. And you can highlight in your activities if GEDC considerations are included. Your results measurement should aim to gather GEDC data and insights. And you can consider including specific GEDC activities. So maybe that would be a GEDC analysis or specific GEDC outputs, for example, reducing barriers for participation of certain groups. Now, just some general principles on project design and approach. So we recognize that every project design is different, but there are some common principles to follow when you're starting out with your project's design. So first of all, it's about identifying what you want to change about the current situation, and then identifying how you would like the improved situation to be. And identifying the needs of the key stakeholders and people affected by the problem. So once you've had a look at that, you should start to define your strategic objectives and identify the resources and actions that you're going to need to deliver them. And here are the typical project design elements used in a lot of our tools and a lot of other organizations' tools. So you typically start off with the inputs and activities, so the inputs are the resources that you require for the project. Activities are the actions and work carried out by the project team during the project. And these should lead to outputs, outcome, and impact. So the outputs are the direct, tangible results of or products of your activities, whereas the outcome Ocean defines this as the end of project outcome. So this is the overall change resulting from the outputs emerging by the end of the project. And then the impact is the long-term change that your project contributes to. And this can be beyond the lifetime of the project. It could be a larger change that you're working with other actors to achieve. And so just to give some examples here. So for some examples of inputs are funding, staff, your partnerships, but also equipment and facilities that you might use through the project, or technical specialists that you bring in on particular subjects. And then activities can include things like training, consultations, events, restoration and monitoring activities, GEDC analysis. And these actions should then lead to your outputs, which could include things like number of people trained, number of database records added, new and improved management plans, accessible knowledge products generated through the project. And these outputs combined should then lead to your overall project outcome. So what we're looking for here is an integrated end of project outcome that includes the marine environment change and the poverty reduction change and how they work together. So here's an example, increased participation and inclusion of community members in evidence-based management practice leads to improved income from fisheries and diversified livelihoods. And then the longer term impact of that outcome would be that the community is more resilient to climate-related shocks and degraded habitat is able to recover in the long term. Now, this is just an example, so you can have a look at other project designs and see what they typically put in these different project design elements. The project design tools that we use, so I mentioned before, we've got the pathway to change. So that's that narrative explaining how and why the project will change the current situation and describe the logical steps and mechanisms to bring about change. So think about those elements when you're writing it. The theory of change diagram, so that's that visual map, also using the elements. And then the log frame that takes those elements and then sets out how to measure the change. And your work plan, of course, it includes the outputs, and you'll be setting out activities under those outputs. So that should also use the same outputs as you mentioned in the previous tools. And the budget, thinking about all of the costs involved. So that's thinking about the inputs and activity side, but also thinking about the cost of measuring your results. So for your theory of change and pathway to change, it's going to be really important to communicate to the expert committee what the problem is and how and why your approach is gonna lead to that desired change. So how and why will your project lead to change? And what are the assumptions that you're making that are critical to the success of your project? How is the project activities are going to lead you to achieve that end of project goal? And how will the project contribute to the marine environment and poverty reduction beyond its lifetime? And of course, you'll need to also try to get across the message around your contribution to promoting gender equality, disability inclusion, and social inclusion. It's really also important in building these tools to consider the external factors. So remember to think about if your project's really tackling the root causes of the specific problem. Think about if your activities are relevant and suitable for that context. And explain if now is the right time. Are the conditions right for the approach that you want to try? Explain what's within the project sphere of influence and what's outside of it. So think about the kind of political and social considerations that are happening in the area that you're working. And of course, consider whether or not your activities and expected benefits are really going to be inclusive of the people in your community. So think about whether women, people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups are able to access the activities that you're proposing. So when you're building the diagram itself, it's really useful to first identify the problem and put that on there, and then define the ultimate impact. So you want to map backwards from the ultimate impact um, to then map out where your outcome outputs and inputs will go. There's a list of assumptions that if you start by creating that list, you can then start to pull out the key ones that are really critical to the success of your project. And then once you've created this visual map, you can start developing your log frame. And once you start developing your log frame, you'll understand whether you need to come back and revisit your theory of change diagram and adapt it to fit what's actually realistic for you to measure. As I said before, you can develop your theory of change as a PDF, but when you're developing it, you can use digital tools or pen and paper. We don't mind how you develop it, but just make sure that that's uploaded as a PDF format. Ideally as 1 to 2 pages max, so that that's able to be attached to your application. And it's something that you can revise throughout the life of your project. We don't see this as a static tool. So I'm just going to pause there to understand and hear from people in the chat whether they have any experience of theory of change diagrams and what kind of digital tools they've used, or whether they prefer a pen and paper approach. So, anybody used any digital tools to create theory of change before? So David mentions Canva. So that's a digital tool that you can try. Daniel mentions Sketch in InDesign, and then they revise it during workshops. Maria and Ngok have suggested Miro. Mural is another one. Miradi as well. Yeah. So really great. So I recommend that you check out some of those tools that are being suggested, because there's a lot of different things out there, and you'll find what works best for you. You can also use PowerPoint as a basic tool, but some of the online tools can be a bit more flexible and easy to use, easy to collaborate with your project team and other stakeholders. Yeah, thank you, Julia. So she suggested draw.io. So there's a lot of different things, and feel free to continue to post ideas in the chat around what are the sort of most useful tools that you have used and have found useful. Okay, on to LogFrame. So we mentioned before, this is the tool for defining your measurable targets. So while the theory of change diagram is showing the steps for the project to lead to change, the log frame is setting out how to measure and assess that change. So it takes that outcome and outputs from the theory of change and then breaks them into the measurable components, which we call indicators. So just to explain a little bit about the logic of it, it's setting out the specific changes you expect to see, what you're going to measure, and what the sources of evidence are. And it should also, a good log frame also shows what time frame you're expecting to see results. And there's assumptions. So the assumptions that you have in your theory of change can also inform the log frame. So just to explain a bit about the logic of assumptions. So for example here, you're looking at activities. So if your activities are conducted and your assumption is true, then you should be able to achieve the outputs that you set out. And if those outputs are achieved and your assumptions at output level are true, then you should be able to achieve your outcome. So that's the basic logic. So if you think about your project design in that sense, it shows that there's a logical flow from your activities up to your outputs and up to your end of project outcome. So if you're finding that it's hard to see the links there, you might need to rethink the logical flow of the information you've laid out.